Hi, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. My name is Sarah Hertel, and I'm the NDC Enhancement Knowledge Specialist with the NDC Partnership Support Unit. And I'm just going to go over a few quick housekeeping agenda items before we start with the actual content of this webinar. So thank you all for joining this session with the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance on the transition away from fossil fuels. We are pleased to offer interpretation in French and in Spanish for this session. So if you would like to listen in a language other than the default language of English, please follow the instructions that I'm going to say here and also on the screen. So at the bottom of the Zoom window, you can click on an icon that looks like a globe, and that will allow you to access interpretation settings. Once you click on the interpretation icon, a pop-up window will appear showing the available languages for interpretation. You're then able to select the language of your preference from that list. And then importantly, so that you're able to hear that language clearly, please click unmute original audio so that you're able to, or mute original audio so that you're able to hear the interpretation and aren't hearing any additional languages over yours. And then a quick few things related to the chat and the question and answer functions. So throughout the session, please feel free to share comments, resources, engage with others in the chat. We also encourage you to introduce yourselves and share what country or organization that you are joining from. And then if you have any specific questions for the speakers, we ask that you use the question and answer function or Q&A at the bottom of the screen so that we can see your question and more easily keep track of those. We will have an open discussion section at the end of the webinar, so we'll be able to have conversations with you related to the questions that you ask. We will then share all of the materials from today's session, including the recording and the PowerPoint with you in a follow-up email. So if you do not wish to appear in the recording, you are able to leave at this point, but we will be recording this session. And finally, just some quick overview of the series itself. We have a Raising Ambition Through Partnership webinar series where we speak about successful examples of different mitigation, adaptation, and cross-cutting efforts that are reflected in the NDCs and intended NDCs from our country members and our partner support through those. So today we'll be discussing many different objectives related to the transition away from fossil fuels and also highlighting the support available under the BOGA fund through the NDC partnership. And with that, I can hand it over to Amanda McKee, who can introduce our first speaker.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Amanda McKee. I'm the Director of Knowledge and Learning with the NDC Partnership, and I'm really pleased to be moderating today's webinar. This is the second webinar that we've had with BOGA to really dive into this issue. And today we're really going to focus on more of a technical overview on the just transition to phase out fossil fuels. And we'll hear from a number of experts who will highlight institutional leadership from their partner perspective, multilateral agencies, research institutes, government programs on how this issue is being tackled. Specifically, we'll dive into tracking progress against the Global Stocktake. We'll hear about MDB support for just transitions in NDCs and LTS. And we'll also hear from the research perspective, looking at specifically the UN Production Gap Report and its implications for NDCs. Our intention is that this will be a fairly open webinar after these presentations. We'll actually open it up for discussions. We'll hear from a few speakers, but then would invite wider interventions from the floor so that we can start to have a discussion on this topic. So With that, to kick us off, I actually want to start by turning it to Sean Bradley, who's the head of Secretariat with BOGA, who's going to share a little bit of some opening remarks and frame this discussion for us today. So Sean, over to you, and thank you again for co-hosting this webinar series with us.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. It's really great to see everyone again. I will actually keep my welcome remarks really short because we've got a fantastic panel and a lot of content to get through. But very quickly, just to recap, it's been 2 weeks now since our first joint BOGA NDCP webinar, where we had speakers from Denmark, Brazil, Kenya, the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Team, joining us in calling for governments to reflect their next steps towards the transition away from fossil fuels in their forthcoming NDCs. And of course, alongside that call, we introduced the NDC program under the BOGA Fund. And really the aim here is to get support for analysis, policy dialogues, transition, technical assistance into the hands of governments that want to reflect that transition away from oil and gas in their NDCs in collaboration with the NDC partnership. So NDCP focal points will have already received a communication on this, and there will be further information circulated in the coming days and weeks. But what's already clear to us is that the country demand for this kind of conversation, this kind of support is beginning to come through. And I'm really glad to see some of you who we've been in conversations with in recent weeks on the wider participant list. So yeah, please do come in and share your perspectives, your offers, your requests in the conversation this morning or this afternoon. As Amanda said, this second webinar is really turning to the how. So how do we deliver an orderly, just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels? What are the actionable next steps that governments and their partners can implement so we can be really concrete and yeah, discuss challenges and opportunities. So yeah, fantastic panel, tons of content to get through. Let me just say a huge thank you to the NDC partnership for co-hosting and collaborating with us on this. And a huge thank you to our speakers and our respondents and to all of you for joining us. Really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Amanda. Back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sean. So we have a fantastic panel discussion to get us started. So I'm going to jump right into it. We're going to start with 3 really short presentations to introduce this topic and talk a little bit about the different perspectives that members are bringing. And then we'll open it up to sort of 3 respondents who will provide some broader remarks. So I'm going to jump right away to our first speaker, who is Tim Gold. He's the chief economist with the International Energy Agency. And Tim is going to talk a little bit about scenarios and tracking progress against the global stocktake. So a really helpful overview to kick us off. And Tim, I will turn it to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Amanda and Sean, and I'm happy to contribute on those topics. And I do have a couple of slides that I wanted to share, so I'll put those up on the screen. But I think it's generally true that this notion of transitioning away from fossil fuels is one of the most interesting, memorable phrases to come out of the recent COP process. Unfortunately, it's quite difficult to pin down exactly what it means in practice. I tell you what, it's useful to decide upfront what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that we are considering how to make people do without essential energy services. So a starting point for this discussion needs to be a recognition that all of the things that we think of when we think of our energy needs, so mobility, heating, cooling, lighting, all of those elements, industrialization for developing economies, and they have to be met in any future scenario that we're talking about. But it's a question of the technologies and the fuels that we use to meet those needs, and how we can meet them while transitioning away from oil and gas, from fossil fuels. I think if this phrase means anything, it means that we need to be thinking very carefully about how we scale up ways to meet those essential energy service demands. But it also means that we need to be thinking carefully about the supply side of energy transitions. So exactly how do we move from today's situation, from today's infrastructure requirements, for today's investment patterns, to in a just and equitable and orderly manner to a very different kind of energy system. And I'm going to focus on oil and gas and just talk us through a little bit about what our scenarios tell us about that process of change. Because at the moment, the momentum behind clean energy deployment is sufficiently strong that we do see a sort of high point reached, a peak reached, if you will, in oil demand around the end of this decade. But we don't see a very substantial decline after that. And that leaves us in a position where, of course, emissions from this sector remain high. So when we think about moving away from that, we have various scenarios. If we take all of the long-term net zero pledges made by governments around the world and thinking they're met in full and on time, you get to a trajectory for oil demand that you see under announced pledges. A trajectory limiting the rise in global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees and implying net zero emissions by 2050 would have even more dramatic implications for oil demand. And when we think about the ways that we move from our current trajectory to that very different world, you can see an extraordinarily important role for electrification. So electrification with clean energy for mobility, but also a variety of other renewables and low emissions fuels to fill in for areas where electrification or direct electrification is not the most cost-effective option, and efficiency is, of course, incredibly important there as well. When we consider the outlook for natural gas, we have a similar situation. We reach a plateau, but no real decline under today's policy settings. We would need to be moving a whole lot faster in order to get on track for outcomes compatible with the Paris Agreement. And again, we can break down that requirement for change by different technology levers and different policy levers. You can see different sources of power generation coming in to displace gas from power systems, although gas retains a very important balancing role for some time to come, even in dramatic energy transition scenarios. And then other technologies coming in to replace gas use in buildings and in industry. And of course, all of that has quite strong implications then for the supply side of the equation. It doesn't mean, even in a very dramatic scenario, such as our net zero by 2050 scenario, that no further investment is needed in oil and gas, because the decline rates, the underlying decline rates in existing fields are sufficiently high that we still need investment in existing and approved projects, but to meet demand in that scenario. In other scenarios, you do need additional projects in order to balance the market, but you see immediately that contingency between the supply and the demand side of the equation. The other consideration that I think is very important from a producer perspective is, for the period in which we continue to need oil and gas supply, minimizing those emissions from the oil and gas industry is an extraordinarily important, and for the moment still very much untapped way of bringing down overall emissions, particularly for methane. And then a final slide is showing how, even as we move towards a more electrified energy system, there is still an important role for molecules, for fuels in the energy system in 2050. And so for producers, for oil and gas companies indeed, there are opportunities adjacent to their current areas of expertise, which would allow them to continue to find a role even in a very different kind of energy system. And as you've seen from the previous slides, moving to zero emissions, net zero emissions, it doesn't immediately imply zero output of oil and gas, because we continue to need it mainly for non-combustion uses. So I will leave it there. I noticed in the introduction that I was asked to comment also on how we're doing relative to the global stocktake. Two words on that. One is that we're doing okay on renewables. So the tripling capacity target, we believe that by 2030, we will be somewhere around 2.6, 2.7 times increase in capacity. So not the full tripling yet, but a sizable distance along that journey. Where we are doing much less well is on efficiency. So we are making much less progress on the introduction of more efficient technologies, and also electrification has inherent efficiency gains. So there's an awful lot more to do there. But I hope that was some useful framing remarks, and I'll pass it back to our hosts. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tim. Extremely useful framing to get this conversation started. And I really appreciate kind of highlighting where we are today, where we need to be, but also breaking that down in terms of the complexity of existing investments, new investments. And I think that leads really nicely to our next speaker, which is Kate Hughes from the Asian Development Bank. And Kate is a senior climate change specialist and a steering committee member for the NDC partnership. And Kate, I'm really interested to hear from you, both the perspective that you bring from the MDBs and particularly how ADB is thinking about just transition in line with the NDCs, LTS, and some of the concrete work and thinking that you're doing. So Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Amanda, and good evening, good morning, everyone. So I have quite a few slides, but I'm just going to go through them quickly to stick to the 5 minutes.
And sorry, Kate, just to interrupt, we're seeing your full PowerPoint. If you're able to
Yes, I'm fixing it.
Okay.
Yes, sorry about that.
That's all right. Okay, great. Next slide. So maybe just a little bit of context when we think about just transition and think about it in terms of multilateral development banks, kind of core operations and the way we support countries. I guess at the core of that, the way we need to move forward is remembering that climate action is not standalone. Really, it's an integral part of development planning for countries. And therefore, multilateral development banks that have development and poverty reduction as core objectives are well suited to support the just transition agenda because it's really aligned with our core objectives. I think one of the other perspectives when we think about the concept of just transition is that it really involves activities that have climate action as the primary purpose, but also complementary activities which in themselves may not be anything to do with climate. And so that also brings in a broad perspective across the ADB in terms of operations that we have in health, in education, operations on public financial management, looking at tax incentives, looking at private sector mobilization, and how do we bring them in and start to align them with the climate agenda. One of the other things of MDBs is that we have this unique position in that we can really understand how you go down that continuum from upstream policy making to investments. And one of the areas that you see countries challenged is that often these higher level NDCs or policies are somewhat disconnected from the way investments are entering investment pipelines. We also have that deep relationship across governments, and particularly when you talk about the just transition, that broad involvement across ministries is really critical to get those development agendas to align with the climate drivers. Next slide, please. So in ADB, we look at the way we engage on climate. And again, we try to look right from the upstream to the downstream. So upstream, we have grant resources, technical assistance, looking at things around preparations of policies, sector investment planning. design of finance mechanisms. We then move to the midstream, which is about how countries can embed these into those systems. So how do we help with fiscal decision-making, with budgeting processes, with central banks? And then to the downstream in terms of how investments are identified and go onto the pipeline. Historically, MDBs and a lot of financiers started at that downstream process and then tried to retrofit it to the policies, whereas trying to look from that upstream policy and shift the investment pipeline is the theory that then the investments that come on are already aligned with the climate and development objectives of the country. Next slide. These are the slides that we showed at COP as the joint MDBs, but they really are looking at the amount of engagements and the geographical spread that the multilateral development banks have around these policy engagements. So you can see across 100, so this was the 2024 stocktake, but across 151 countries, there's currently 1,200 engagements ongoing. So how the MDBs deliver this support around NDCs, long-term strategies, just transition is really critical for a lot of countries. Next slide. And you can see over the years that the demand for this type of support is really growing. Each year on year, there's a significant increase. And that means we also have to call on our shareholders and donors to help raise money for these types of activities, because I think there's a greater recognition on the need for this support, and that, as I said previously, unless that upstream enabling policy and institutional environment is really strong, then we won't get the right type of downstream investments. On just transition, there's definitely been an increase. This shows the 1-year increase of 35%, but from the year before that, it was an even bigger jump as countries specifically engage with us on the issue of just transition. Next slide. I'll skip this one for time and maybe go to the next one. So one of the other things that the MDBs, next slide, next. One of the other things that the MDBs recognize is that the cycle of NDCs on 5 years doesn't necessarily give you those long-term investment pathways or that long-term certainty that you need for the right type of market signals and other things to identify the right type of investments. So that twinning of the NDC with the long-term strategy is really critical to try to drive this forward. And so the multilateral development banks have announced a joint long-term strategy program. It's now operational and has its first funds. And the objective of that is really to try to support that longer term planning and policy making that will help drive that investment shift. Next slide. So specifically on the just transition and how the MDBs are supporting that. So we started really in 2021. We produced the MDB high-level principles, which were really a kind of starting point on specific just transition, articulation of specific just transition support for MDBs. And then since then, we have a joint MDB Just Transition Working Group, and we've been really looking at how do you operationalize the concept. And it's really more challenging than anyone imagined to work out how you actually operationalize what just transition is and what type of support countries need to do that. Last year, the kind of core piece of work that we worked on jointly was looking at outcome indicators. So what does success or what does impact in terms of just transition mean? And through that process, it really helped us to frame the MDB thinking on what just transition means and how we can go about supporting countries. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry, I'm just going to skip through because I'm conscious I've got a lot of slides in this time. And next slide. So one of the things that we need to be cognizant on when we talk about just transition is that just transition is not necessarily only good development. And when you start to look broadly at the issues that are related to just transition around socioeconomic impact, socioeconomic transition, broader support that's needed, there is a risk that the agenda becomes so wide. And so one of the ways that the MDBs are looking at addressing that is that, you know, for activities to count as just transition or be classified as just transition support, that you really need to establish that transition context. And it's similar to in adaptation and resilience, how you establish that climate risk context. So looking at what the actual intent to transition is, what those transition impacts and opportunities are, and what the contribution of the intervention will be to helping manage those impacts. Next slide. And so this is the last slide, but this is looking at how the MDBs have jointly come up with categorizing or looking at a framework for how to understand just transition and the types of activities that we can do to support it. So it's a matrix. So first of all, you establish that intent, and then we look at these 3 focus areas. So one is on institution and stakeholders. So what type of support can we provide for just transition diagnostics, for the upstream analytical work, strategy development, planning, and that key aspect of just transition around stakeholder engagement. The second focus area is around employment, skills, and livelihood. What type of support can we give for education, for employment, for social protection, all of those aspects that are critical as part of the transition. And then the last one looks at infrastructure and productivity. And that's around economic diversification, economic productivity, support for SMEs. But also interestingly, we had looked a lot at this issue of development of infrastructure. And I think maybe the last point I want to make on that is that when you look across these focus areas and you look at the type of support that countries need to pursue a just transition, there's a really interesting dimension that comes in terms of timing and sequencing, because some of the support that is needed needs to come ahead of the decarbonisation activity for a just transition rather than being reactionary. And particularly on that last dimension on infrastructure, that can be very important. So for example, if there is going to be a particularly vulnerable town or region that is going to transition away from a fossil fuel or lose industry and lose jobs, it may need upfront investments in non-climate related activities first, around new infrastructure, economic diversification, support for small business, before the investment comes in to undertake the actual decarbonisation activity. So looking across these focus areas, but also looking at the planning and the sequencing of how these activities are rolled out. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Amanda.
Great, thank you, Kate. And I'm going to turn right away to our third presentation to round out this initial thinking and bring a little bit more of the research perspective. So I'm going to turn next to Ploy Achakoulis-Ut, who's the policy lead on climate science and mitigation with the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Team. And we'll hear a little bit about the UN Production Gap Report and some of its implications around NDCs and implementation of the first Global Stocktake. So Ploy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to begin with highlighting 2 scientific facts to briefly set the context for my presentation and the Production Gap Report series. So we all know that deep, rapid, and sustained cuts in greenhouse gas emissions are needed to keep 1.5 degrees C within reach, of which around 76% for all greenhouse gases stem from fossil fuel production and use, and even a higher percentage for carbon dioxide specifically. We also know that the committed CO2 emissions from existing fossil fuel production and combustion infrastructure each exceed the remaining global carbon budget to limit long-term warming to 1.5 with a 50% likelihood. And in fact, the committed emissions from existing coal mines and from oil and gas extraction projects each exceed this remaining budget as well. And so therefore, the pertinent questions we really wanted to answer through the production gap report series are, firstly, how quickly can and should we transition away from fossil fuels to keep 1.5 within reach? And secondly, how far off track are government's national energy plans and strategies in aggregate with respect to these goals? Next slide, please. So taking inspiration from the long-standing UNEP emissions gap report series that tracks the ambition gap between the emissions level implied by the full implementation of countries' existing NDCs and the emissions pathways that would be consistent with the Paris Agreement's temperature goal. In 2019, several research institutions led by the Stockholm Environment Institute in collaboration with the UN Environment Programme started the Production Gap Report series to track a similar gap for fossil fuel production, given the lack of mainstream policy attention on the supply side of fossil fuels. However, unlike NDCs and emissions reductions targets, countries' plans and targets for fossil fuel production are not yet consistently and transparently reported. And so we first estimate the so-called government plans and projections pathways, as shown by the red line in this figure of different pathways of global fossil fuel production, based on our own review and compilation of recently and publicly available national energy outlooks and strategies of 19 major fossil fuel producing countries. And this was as of August 2023, that accounted for around 80% of global fossil fuel production. Their aggregated projections were then scaled up to a global pathway based on these countries' estimated future shares of global production as modeled by the IEA under a scenario consistent with countries fulfilling their stated climate policies. Next, to quantify the production gap, we identified the global pathways of fossil fuel production that would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees Celsius, as shown in this figure by the purple and green lines and their respective interquartile ranges. And these pathways represent total coal, oil, and gas supply intended for both energy and non-energy uses, and are informed and derived by selected mitigation scenarios as compiled in the IPCC 6th assessment report. And in a nutshell, these model scenarios chart out cost-optimized pathways for limiting warming to a given temperature threshold by relying on different combinations and extents of major mitigation strategies to transform our energy and land use systems to achieve net zero emissions. And so the production gap is basically the discrepancy between the global levels of fossil fuel production under the government plans and projections pathway and those under the 1.5C or 2C consistent pathways in any given year. Next slide, please. So in our 2023 analysis, I wanted to highlight here some of the key findings. We found that in aggregate, governments are planning to produce in 2030 around 110% more fossil fuels than would be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as you can see in the top figure, the total production gap grows wider over time out to 2050, which was the final year in our analysis. Now, the production gap can also be quantified and shown in terms of its component fuels, as shown in the bottom figure. And taken together, we found that government plans and projections would lead to an increase in global coal production until 2030, before a modest decline, and in global oil and gas production would be increasing out until at least 2050. And by 2030, the global production levels under our so-called GPP pathways would lead to 460% more coal, 29% more oil, and 82% more gas than the respective levels under 1.5C consistent pathways. And in the report, we also did more detailed analysis of the individual underlying 1.5C consistent scenarios and drew 3 key conclusions from this sensitivity analysis. First, to stay on track to achieve net zero CO2 emissions by mid-century and limit long-term warming to 1.5, global production and consumption of all 3 fossil fuels need to decline substantially between now and 2050, alongside other key climate mitigation strategies like scaling up renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, and reducing methane emissions. This is also true regardless of whether a scenario relies on future large-scale deployment of fossil fuel use coupled to carbon capture and storage, or to carbon dioxide removal measures to varying degrees. Second, the modeled reductions in coal, oil, and gas depend on and influence one another, especially in the nearer term. And so it would be important to focus on and set reduction targets for all three fuels. And finally, as I alluded to, the pace and magnitude of modeled reductions are particularly sensitive to assumed reliance on CCS and/or CDR, especially for gas. And so taking a precautionary approach would suggest that at a minimum, we should be aiming for a near total phase out of coal by 2040 and a combined reduction in oil and gas by at least 3/4 by 2050 from 2020 levels. Next slide, please. So in the production gap report, we also provided individual country profiles of 20 key fossil fuel producers, assessing government's latest climate ambitions and their plans, policies, and strategies that either support fossil fuel production and expansions or that begin to facilitate a managed and equitable transition away from it. Today, I wanted to highlight 4 key findings. First, we found that of the 17 of the 20 fossil fuel producing countries profiles have pledged to achieve net zero emissions. So at the time, but Mexico have now also pledged a net zero target. So many of them have launched initiatives to reduce emissions from fossil fuel production activities, but none have committed to reduce coal, oil, and gas production and exports in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. In fact, many continue to support, invest in, and plan on the expansion of fossil fuel production. In particular, we found that many producer and importer countries continue to promote gas as an essential bridge or transition fuel, but with no apparent plans to transition away from it later. Nevertheless, we found some encouraging signs of change. So in our 2023 report, 4 countries have begun to develop scenarios for domestic fossil fuel production that would be consistent with their national or international climate goals. And finally, support for a just energy transition is growing, although such discourses and policies are still mostly limited to addressing coal-fired power generation only. Next slide, please. And so the most recent edition of the Production Gap Report was published just ahead of COP28 in November 2023. And as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, soon after that, the first Global Stocktake outcome delivered landmark commitments from parties to align their new NDCs with 1.5 degrees C, as well as to contribute to achieving 1.5 C aligned global energy transition goals. And so this NDC cycle really provides an important opportunity for countries to begin to align their national energy and development strategies with near and long-term climate goals and ambitions. In particular, it will be important for countries to develop a comprehensive and just energy transition strategy so that we ensure energy access and affordability in the transition and with provisions for affected workers and communities. We should also recognize that countries have differentiated transition capacities and existing socioeconomic dependence on the fossil fuel economy. And there is more of this covered in the 2020 Production Gap Report, as well as more and recent literature, such as the 2023 CSO Equity Review Report. And finally, it would be important to address both the supply and demand of fossil fuels and of energy supply in general. So we think that it would be important to set near and long-term reduction targets for fossil fuel production and use to complement other energy transition targets and climate mitigation targets. Next and last slide, please. So on this last point, in the same way that global 1.5 C aligned mitigation scenarios assessed in the IPCC AR6, as well as other authoritative resources like the IEA's Net Zero by 2050 roadmap that Tim discussed earlier, have been used to inform key global mitigation benchmarks, including, for example, the need to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030 and by 60% by 2035 on 2019 levels, as well as the tripling of renewables capacity and doubling of energy efficiency goals. Similar benchmarks can be derived from these scenarios to guide near and longer term fossil fuel-related reduction targets. So, for example, as Tim mentioned earlier, the IEA has estimated that under declining fossil fuel demand in the net zero scenario, no investments in new coal mines, unabated coal plants, and upstream oil and gas projects would be needed. Secondly, we found that these scenarios would suggest that at a minimum, we should be reducing global fossil fuel supply and demand by at least 30% by 2030 and by around 40 to 50% by 2035 relative to current levels. For the power sector specifically, we should be looking, the advanced economies should phase out unabated coal by early 2030s and achieve net zero power generation by 2035, and unabated gas is phased out completely globally by 2040. And finally, we should also be aiming to cut methane emissions from oil and gas production in the energy sector by around 75% on current levels. And I'll hand it back to you, Amanda. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ploy, for that the really detailed explanation of the production gap report. I'm really pleased to switch gears a little bit and bring in a few of our discussants who will share a little bit of the country perspective. And I'm going to jump right in and start by introducing our first speaker from Nigeria, who's Dr. Olumide Abimbola, who's the Executive Director at the Africa Policy Research Institute. So if you could just give us maybe 2 minutes of quick reactions to that, and we'll go to our next speaker after that.
Thank you very much. 2 minutes, I'm just scratching my throat in 2 minutes, but I'm going to try and keep it short. Thanks to BOGA and to NDC Partnership for inviting me to sort of bring some Nigerian perspective to the discussion here. I lead a think tank called APRI. We have offices in Nigeria, in Abuja, and also in Berlin in Germany. In Nigeria, we work mainly with the government around climate transition issues, from methane abatement to adaptation to climate finance and so on. Nigeria, we know the government's dependence on oil and gas for revenue, so I won't go too deep into that. Instead, what I'm going to do is to talk through 2 things that are happening at the moment in Nigeria, which I consider to be important and we should kind of be thinking about, given that Nigeria depends a lot on oil and gas, and there is not going to be much of a change in that in the short term, right? But we can plan for the long term here. So first of all, we are at a pivotal moment for Nigeria's climate action in general. Nigeria is updating its NDC right now, but at the same time, it's also preparing its next national development plan for the next 5 years. So it's a key opportunity to try and find a way to align the two, because we hear often from countries like Nigeria that we cannot sacrifice economic development for climate action. But these two are being developed at the same time. So it's an opportunity to sort of make sure that they align somehow. And we at APRI are working together with the government around this. So with the Ministry for Budget and Planning, which is in charge of the development plan, and with the National Climate Change Council, which is responsible for the NDC. And also with other ministries and agencies in Nigeria. And feeding into this process is a piece of work that we've done, which is to have a researcher work with 7 different, so a researcher each working with 7 different ministries to look at what a climate change lens to their work looks like. So we had transportation, we had finance, we had planning, we had power, and so on. And the work that they did is sort of fitting into the NDP development process that is ongoing at the moment. The second thing that I want to talk about is the idea of a country platform for Nigeria. The idea is that a country platform will support sort of coordinated technical and financial efforts towards Nigeria's climate and energy transition ambitions. On this, we are currently working with the government to convene a South-South peer learning workshop at the end of this month. The idea is to bring to the country JETP countries to workshop with the government how they approached internal coordination to get to the point where they were able to have conversations with international partners on what they want to do and how international partners can support them in doing that. So this is on climate diplomacy, climate finance in general, but also technical support just for the transition, because sometimes this is one thing that is missing in the mix for countries. And at this workshop, we're also going to have, so we're having South Africa, Indonesia, and Senegal, but we're also going to have Nigerian government officials, but also CSOs and private sector actors at the table, sort of workshopping this in a closed door workshop with the external delegates coming to tell them about the experience. In closing, it's taken a bit of a while for Nigeria to get going on climate action, but I think a mix of different things at the moment is making it impossible to not look at climate as a key concern, but also as an opportunity. And we're generally getting there. Thank you.
Excellent. No, so much to cover in 2 minutes. Really, really appreciate the perspective though. And I'm going to switch over to Kenya next. And pleased to introduce Charles Waguhu, who's the Executive Director at NZ Ijayo. If you can share a little bit from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks again to BOGA and NDC Partnership for arranging this wonderful webinar. So at NZ Ijayo, I think given the Global Stocktake outcome, our work has involved, pushing for policy recommendations that put forth to a lot of African countries around the opportunities that might arise from the stocktake. And so the first thing was sort of in terms of seeking to expand renewable energy infrastructure on the continent, unlocking Africa's capacity, potential of 10 terawatts of solar, 350 gigawatts of hydro, as well as 110 gigawatts of wind. But narrowing down to Kenya, given the time limitations, I'd say, so what is already happening? And of course, Kenya is leading in the high ambition. I think Kenya has already seen, sort of a majority renewable energy already. But given that, there's still room, for additional expansion of its current renewable grid. At the moment, one of the key interventions has been, through the Kenya presidency, is undertaking the Early Movers Roundtable, which firstly seeks to unlock renewable energy. And it does this through looking at the barriers towards that deployment. And so firstly, addressing the grid challenges, looking at off-takers, both new like sustainable aviation fuel, as well as the old off-takers, especially in terms of addressing the financing gap by ensuring they sort of cross-guaranteeing of each other between off-takers and independent power producers. For Kenya as well, Kenya is the first BOGA fund recipient, and Kenya has used the fund so far in terms of working out, key transitional pathways, and also in developing its green industrialization strategy. But having said that, I think what we are seeing is that not only in countries like Kenya, which is already 100% renewable, but also in countries like Namibia, even though it has its newfound resources, that they are still seeking to both reduce emissions and enhance removals, i.e. by increasing its sink capacity. And this is evidenced by its NDC 3.0, that it's one of the few countries that have come out so far. So let me just, in terms of just sort of a quick overview, I think that's pretty much what I have to share now within the 2 minutes, and hopefully we have some time for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And yes, I would encourage everyone to use the chat box if you have questions, if you have further information that you want to share. I'm going to turn to our last country perspective before I bring in some of our delivery partners to share views as well. And very pleased to welcome from Colombia, Ana Carolina Gonzalez Espinosa, who's the Senior Director for Programs at the Natural Resource Governance Institute. So Carolina, over to you for again, just 2 minutes of quick reflections.
Thank you, Amanda. And in the case of Colombia, I guess as with many other fossil fuel producing countries that heavily depend on this oil and gas sector, we definitely see a need to anchor this transition pathway in a longer term policy process. and not just term initiative. And the NDC is clearly an opportunity for this. Not only because it brings together the perspective from different actors and different sectors, which is part of what is needed for the major transformations this type of countries would need to face, but also because the NDC should also connect with these clear sources of funding. And actually, we think that the financial mechanisms that countries like Colombia are considering putting in place through country platforms should also be connected to clear NDCs. And so in that context, the NDC, at least for Colombia, should at least include three main elements, in my view. One is assessing energy transition risk and defining energy transition plans beyond oil and gas. And although there are some documents here and there in Colombia that kind of acknowledge the existence of energy transition risk for the country and the possible impacts of this reduction in oil demand, global oil demand that Tim mentioned, I think we need the government to acknowledge and to be transparent about the calculation of what those transition risks are and define, a clear roadmap of how to plan for the impacts that may produce. And the second element I think we should include in an NDC process is the role of the national oil companies. We have in previous initial research understood that only 10 out of, I think, 51 countries with NOCs have mentioned these names of these NOCs in NDCs. And I think it is important that the government of Colombia, given the outsized role that Ecopetrol plays in the economy, could include specific targets for Ecopetrol in the NDC process. And this includes, of course, emission reduction targets, but also acknowledging, again, what are the energy transition risks and what are the plans that the company is putting in place to diversify away from fossil fuels? And maybe the third and last element that I think we should also anchor in the NDC process is the planning for just transition in oil-dependent regions, which I think is similar to what Kate and Ploy mentioned of the necessity of linking, development possibilities with climate action planning. And I think with the support from BOGA and also in partnership with the Ministry of Mine, we are conducting studies in some oil-producing countries to understand what are the type of transition risks they might face, the impact of these risks, and how these countries or these particular regions could find alternatives to or propose transition pathways away from oil and gas. And that includes, of course, how to compensate workers and community, but also the diversifications initiative that were mentioned before. So I will keep it there, of course, to continue the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna Carolina. And thank you for mentioning as well the support through BOGA, because one of the things that we really want to touch on through this webinar is not just some of the technical developments and possibilities, but also outlining support that's available to countries to be able to start to think about this and implement this. So I'm going to actually turn next to a few people from the floor to share some final reflections and just 1 or 2 minutes. I know we could go on for a few more hours, but from UNEP, let's start with UNEP. We have Federico Antonio Canu. We're going to unmute you to allow you to come in, but would be good to hear from UNEP's perspective as a delivery partner.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Amanda. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to chip in to the discussion. Well, my name is Federico. Thank you for the introduction. I work for the United Nations Environment Program, Copenhagen Climate Center. And we've been supporting developing countries in their low carbon and climate resilient developments for, more than 3 decades. And also in recent times, including more than, I think, 30 plus submissions to the original intended NDCs. And just in relation to the support in phasing out fossil fuels and the current NDC 3.0 development, just want to mirror some inputs especially from Kate and Carolina, where we see that this process usually requires, amongst other things, 2 main elements of support. So on one side, basically the analytical work and inputs that goes into guiding countries towards setting ambitious but realistic NDC 3.0 commitments. So the plans and strategies and scenarios for that. And on the other side, it requires support on the implementation frameworks and financing mechanisms to achieve those targets. And just on our side, we see that one of the enablers for countries is this modeling and modeling credible emission reduction pathways for key sectors. We have other tools that we use. We have our own in-house model that we developed, the greenhouse gas abatement cost model. I think I can post it in the chat if people are interested. But basically, to show these pathways towards decarbonization for countries and then informing the NDC targets with that. On the implementation side, or at least further downstream, one of the countries, just to give an example, that we worked with on implementation frameworks is Mauritius, which, like many other developing countries, and especially small island development states, relies very heavily on the import of fossil fuels. It has also communicated a phase out of coal and is used for electricity generation. And here we have supported Mauritius in the past with the development of a national mitigation strategy and action plan, with this modeling work, scenarios, identifying mitigation options to set in line with NDC targets, also providing capacity for implementation, transparency to track and so forth. But Mauritius, especially now faces rising energy demand and also the lack of financing to promote implementation. So here we looked at the energy efficiency, so maybe mirroring Tim's final comments, which is oftentimes overlooked. And here, basically trying to develop concrete implementation frameworks. So you might have set energy efficiency targets in the NDCs. We see that many countries have set it, but oftentimes lack implementation instruments. So basically looking at how energy performance contracting and facilitating energy performance contracting to a guarantee mechanism, and basically leverage and capitalize it through the available climate funds and blended finance. Just some reflections on what we're doing and how we approach this process. And also through the NDC partnership, of course, as implementation partner, we support a variety of countries with their NDC 3.0 developments towards their low carbon development and fossil fuel phase.
Wonderful.
Opportunity.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing UNEP's perspective. And then I want to switch next and bring in the coal perspective from the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and would invite Pallavi Singh to come in and just share one word, if you can, 1 minute.
Hello, I was frantically typing my intervention in the chat in case I wasn't able to chat. But thanks for bringing us in. I know we haven't got that much time, but just wanted to say thanks to their presentations. Really demonstrates how coal in NDCs can really deliver on what we're trying to achieve here. The current or the existing round of NDCs, only 9% of them include policies and plans on coal. So the work of NDCP and organisations like BOGA to really work with countries to get these targets in NDCs really has impact. So for example, you see countries like Panama, who've already included a 2026 coal phase out date and renewable energy targets. And I think they were one of the countries that NDCP worked with, so demonstrating the impact there. And then just to plug as well, a big thing that we're working with members, they know that government inclusion in this process really will help this initiative. So they are working on a no new coal call to action, where 26 countries are including no new coal within their NDC, and we're looking to increase that this year, and happy to work together with any other countries. But I'll keep it brief because I know you've got lots to try and conclude. So thank you.
Thanks, Pallavi. And I want to give the final word to our partners at IISD, and I have Paula Pera, who's on the line. Paula, if you want to come in and just share again 1 minute to wrap up here.
Hello, can you hear me and see me? Yeah,
Yes,
hello
perfect.
everyone. Thank you very much for the presentations. The work we're doing resonates a lot with that. We have been focusing on how previous NDCs, we have been tracking how previous NDCs have mentioned supply side issues and fossil fuel production in the past, and found that is not a very common topic that NDCs mentioned, which is a big missed opportunity because as some of the panelists here mentioned, in the end, NDCs and long-term development strategies, they become the investment plan and they become documents that are guiding many other development plans and other documents. So it would be really a missed opportunity if this new round of NDCs will not account for that aspect. And based on this, we have produced a set of guidelines, which I'm going to post in the chat here, which have also been added to the NDC Partnership 3.0 Navigator, but I'll post the link for making it easier to find them, where we basically explore how many other countries have already included some of the supply side issues in their NDCs and how countries could include these issues in the new NDCs, which go from more transparency in terms of plans for production, reserves, to issues like international alliances and partnerships like PPCA, BOGA, and many others, which countries have joined since the last NDC, but have not mentioned necessarily in the new NDC, to actual reduction plans, and very critically, which a lot of countries have progressed but have not mentioned directly in the NDC, just transition measures that they are taking, especially in the producing regions, to move away from fossil fuels. So I'll keep it short, but I will post the document. I have to say we are very open to engage in conversations with any government or any organization that finds our messages resonating, to investigate a bit further how their specific case could be better reflected in their new NDC. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let me just wrap up. We could have clearly gone on for another hour with this discussion, but I hope this was helpful, giving a little bit of food for thought in terms of how countries are thinking about this topic in line with their NDC 3.0 development this year, and particularly in line with a just transition away from fossil fuels. I really encourage partners to reach out so we can continue this collaboration, but also would encourage countries to reach out if this is a topic that you are interested in. There is support available from partners, including a dedicated NDC window available through BOGA, something that can be helpful, impactful as you're thinking about your NDC 3.0, but more importantly, its implementation over the next years. So with that, thank you again to everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going.